We live in the most connected age in human history. Most people have access to more information than at any point in the last 300,000 years. And yet, politics feel broken, truth feels elusive, trust is continuously collapsing. Nobody seems to agree on what's even real. This isn't some kind of a coincidence, it is a pattern that is unfolding as we speak. In 2018, Yuval Noah Harari wrote a book that wasn't just trying to predict the future, it was trying to explain the present. 21 Lessons for the 21st Century is a diagnostic manual for why the world feels the way it does. And if you understand these lessons, you'll start understanding why your own confusion isn't some kind of a personal failure, it is just structural condition. Here's the thread that runs through all of it. Humans have built a world that evolves faster than the stories we used to make sense of. And until we upgrade our internal operating system, no external fix, no election, no technology, no policy will ever stick. Let me show you what I mean. See, for the most of human history, change was slow enough that each generation could inherit a working model of reality from the last one. You learned how to farm from your parents, and that knowledge stayed useful for your entire life. The Industrial Revolution broke that contract, but slowly you could still learn a trade at 18 years old and work it until 65. What's different now is actually the speed. Not just the technology is actually changing, technology has historically always changed, but that it's actually changing faster than institutions, cultures, and individual psychology can actually absorb. Harari points to three forces converging at once. One, the automation of not just physical labor but cognitive labor. Two, the potential for biological stratification that actually makes the previous inequality look quaint. Number three, the fact that our collective imagination about the future is still stuck in frameworks from the last century. Think about work. Every previous revolution automated muscles. This one automates thought. And here is the uncomfortable part. It's not just that jobs disappear, it's that the entire category of human capability becomes economically irrelevant. Harari calls this the useless class, not unemployed, not unneeded, people with nothing that the market actually values. Now, here's where smart people actually push back. Since the book's publication, we've seen that the generative AI exploding massively. And if you actually look at the actual labor market since 2018, the picture is more complicated than mass uselessness. New categories of work have emerged even as old ones actually eroded. The concern may be premature or at least misstructured, but we're not seeing a useless class so much as turbulent reshuffling. But even if the timeline is wrong, the structural question fundamentally remains the same. What happens when there is simply less that humans are needed to do? That question hasn't gone anywhere. It's sitting right here in front of us for all of us to fundamentally answer. And then there is the equality dimension, which is more unsettling than the jobs question. Previous revolutions created economic inequality. Some people had more money than others, but biologically, a rich person in 1850 and a poor person in 1850 were actually the same species. Harari raises the possibility that the next revolution doesn't just create wealth gaps, it creates species gaps. If the wealthy can afford genetic enhancement, cognitive upgrades, life extension, not just better education or healthcare, but fundamentally different biological capabilities, then inequality stops being about resources and starts being about what it means to a human. We don't talk about this enough because our political imagination is still trapped in the 20th century. We argue about tax rates, we argue about minimum wages, while the actual trajectory points somewhere entirely different. This is what Harari means when he says that we need better science fiction, not dystopias or utopias, but serious thinking about the actual path that we're fundamentally headed on. And this speed creates a specific kind of danger that bridges into something larger. As everything moves faster, the system that emerged to manage complexity, which is governments, corporations, institutions, which are increasingly relying on data to make those decisions, not to just inform decisions, but to actually make them, algorithm determine what you actually see, what you buy, who gets a loan, who gets flagged. Harari's point isn't that surveillance is new, right? He states that you always have had people who have watched people. It's just that the scale and the granularity and the unprecedented that it is happening is not primary through governments but through corporations that have no democratic accountability for carrying out this fundamental operation. The deeper problem is also that when an algorithm knows your habits, your fear, your desires better than you do, the liberal idea of free choice starts to hollow out. Not because somebody is forcing you, but because your options are being curated by a system that understands your psychology at a level that you don't. This is how the technological challenge becomes a political one. Because here's what actually happened after 2008. The story that had organized global politics since the fall of Soviet Union, that liberal democracy and free markets had won, that history was essentially over. That the remaining work was just incremental improvement. That story cracked. Not all at once, but steadily. The financial crisis showed that the system could fall on its own terms. The recovery was slow and uneven. The benefit of the growth flowed upward, and people who had been told that this is the best system, just be patient, started to feel like they'd been sold something. This delusion is the context for everything that actually followed. It's not that people suddenly became nationalist or anti immigrant or a populist. It's that the liberal story lost its persuasive power, and when a story collapses at that level, something actually rushes in to fill that particular vacuum. For about 200,000 years, humans lived in groups of maybe 150 people, small enough that everybody had a name, a face, a story. Then, in an evolutionary blink, we built nations of hundreds of millions of people and asked the same brain that evolved for the village to feel loyal for all of it. Nationalism isn't a bug in human psychology, it's the patch we wrote to make an ancient brain run a modern operating system, and like most patches, it comes with bugs of its own. And the bugs are the precedences that we are facing every single day and are the issues that we are fundamentally battling on. What we're seeing now isn't the resurgence of nationalism, it's the failure of the liberal alternative to provide the belonging and the identity that humans fundamentally needed. When globalism tells you you're a citizen of the world, it's offering an abstraction that doesn't map onto any emotional reality. Nationalism, on the contrast, offers something visceral, a story about who you are, where you belong, and who your people are. The question isn't whether that impulse is legitimate. It is, to an extent, I completely agree. The question is what happens when it gets weaponized? And it gets weaponized precisely because political systems are struggling with problems that don't respect borders. Climate change, pandemics, artificial intelligence, capital flows. These are global challenges that are being handed by national institutions designed for a world of sovereign states. So politicians do the only thing that they actually can. They turn global problems into national narratives. Immigration becomes about protecting the homeland. Trade becomes subject about national greatness. Technology becomes about competing with rival nations. Look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a fundamentally nationalist project driven by a civilizational narrative about Russian identity and Western encroachment. Look at the rise of populist movement across Europe and the US. Each movements are actually offering a different version of we've been betrayed and we need to take back control. These aren't isolated phenomena. They're the same structural pattern existing in itself in different contexts in today's world. And then there's actually terrorism, which Harari frames in a fundamental way that actually cuts through all the noise and goes straight to the point. Terrorism isn't about distraction, it's theater. The direct damage of even the worst terrorist attack is statistically tiny compared to the car accidents, the heart disease, or almost any other cause of death. The point is to provoke and speculate an overreaction, right? To make a powerful state respond disproportionately, thereby provoking the terrorist's narrative that the state is oppressive and that the terrorist is the underdog. By that metric, terrorism has been speculatively successful. The amount of money, surveillance, and political energy devoted to counterterrorism is vastly out of the proportion to the actual threat, which is exactly what the theater requires to keep the show running. What's striking is that the entire political crisis, the disillusionment, the nationalism, the immigration anxiety, the terrorism overreaction, the return of war as a tool to the statecraft has unfolded alongside a parallel crisis that makes it almost impossible to resolve. Because you can't have a functioning democracy if people can't agree on what is fundamentally true and what is fundamentally the value of the state. We've entered the era of post truth, but Harari's insight is that this isn't something as new as we actually think it is. Humans have always operated on stories more than facts. What's changed is actually the underlying technology that we're discussing for the past couple of minutes. Social media algorithms don't spread misinformation because they're evil. They spread it because engagement drives revenue, and outrage actually goes on to drive engagement. The revelations and the retaliations around platform algorithms in recent years laid bare was something that was fundamentally very obvious, that the systems that mediate our information environments are optimized for attention and not accuracy, and this is fundamentally clear in the first place. But there is a deeper layer to this. The more information that we actually have, the more we realize how much we don't know. Modern problems are so specialized that no individual can understand them. You can't evaluate or evacuate climate models, or the epidemiological data that is sitting right in front of you, or you can't just take in a monetary policy and then try to evaluate it simultaneously. You have to trust experts, which means you have to trust you have to trust the fundamental fact that experts are trustworthy, that the institutions employing them are honest, and that the system for selecting which experts get heard isn't corrupted. There's a lot of trust to ask for in an era that is institutionally a distrust. And there's also a justice problem. Every group has historical wounds, every nation has injustices in the past. The question isn't whether those wounds are real, right? They are truly real, and each part of the society has actually gone through this more deeply than I'm just narrating in words here in this video. The question is whether politics became a perpetual contest over who suffered more and who owes whom. Harari isn't saying get over it, right? What he's trying to say is that he's subtly trying to point out that if your entire political identity is built around grievance, you become incapable of solving the present problems, and you're always looking backwards and blaming the crisis that happened many years ago and which is not even relevant in today's day and age. This is where humility enters, not as a moral virtue, but as an epistemistic necessity. Every culture believes its own story is the central drama of the human history. Europeans centered their experience, right? Americans centered theirs. Now, other civilizations are going to try and do the same, and when I speak, they are actually trying to do the same. The humility is to recognize that your story is one among many, that your suffering is real but it's not unique, that your values are meaningful but are not universal and cannot be forced upon every single person who is actually living in this world. This isn't some kind of a weakness, right? Accepting this doesn't mean that you're weak. It's the only posture from which you can actually see how the world is fundamentally working. And this humility or lack of it connects directly to the deepest layer of the crisis. Because when politics fails and truth fractures, people don't just become confused, they become untethered. And humans cannot tolerate being untethered, right? Because we need meaning in our lives way more than we fundamentally need oxygen, if that makes sense. This is where religion becomes the most relevant development for human to focus on, not as a relic but as a living force that is driving day-to-day activities. Harari's observation is subtle but is fundamentally strong. Religion doesn't disappear with modernity, it mutated. In many places, God didn't die, God just got recruited. Religious identity became a marker of national identity. You see this in the way Hindu identity has been woven into the Indian politics, and it's actively playing out in every single election in sheer volumes than I can actually express in words. In the fusion of Christian identity with the American political movements, which are still hot battles and are being fought as and when I speak, in how Russians' orthodoxy serves the Russian state's civilizational narrative, the religion isn't the point, the belonging is. Survey data consistently shows that declining religious affiliation in wealthy countries, particularly among young people, is fundamentally true. But what's actually replacing it isn't secular rationality, because a lot of people think that religion is going to then get replaced by some kind of secular rationality that every single person can actually adopt and the society just becomes a beautiful place, right? That's not what is actually happening. What happens is a patchwork of identitarian commitments, you know, ideological tribes and digital communities that provide the warmth of the belonging but without the depth. We're in the middle of loneliness epidemic that isn't about being alone. It's about being surrounded by people and still feeling unseen or unheard. Harari makes a distinction that most people miss. Secularism isn't the absence of meaning, it's the separation of three things that religion used to bundle upon or bundle together: truth claims, moral frameworks, and political power. A secular person can be deeply spiritual, they can find profound meaning. What they don't actually do is they claim that their meaning comes from a supernatural source that everyone else is obligated to accept. Secular ethics in Harari's framing resets on a few pillars: truth, facing reality as it is, not as we wish it could be; compassion, reducing suffering; equality, recognizing that everyone's experience matters and should be respected equally; and responsibility, owning responsibility, which is consistently owning the consequences of your choices because there's no cosmic plan to fall back on or to blame, right? The challenge is not that this is a cognitively demanding task. Religion offers a package deal. Here's what's true, here's what's good, here's who you are, here's what is going to happen to you when you actually try, right? Secularism offers tools and then asks you to do the work for yourself. For most of human history, that was too much to ask for, and even in today's day and age, I personally feel it is still too much. Which brings us to the question Harari ultimately cares about the most. If the world is changing faster than humans can actually adopt, if politics is broken, if truth is fractured, if meaning is harder to find, then what do we do? Specifically, what do we teach our children? This is where the argument loops back into the beginning. If jobs keep changing, teaching specific skills is actually pointless. They'll become obsolete before a student enters the workforce. If truth is contested, teaching the facts is naive. If meaning isn't handed down, teaching a single worldview is dishonest to the children. Harari's answer is something that is deceptively simple, and it's worth taking seriously even if you're skeptical. The most important thing to teach isn't a body of knowledge, it's the ability to know your own mind, to observe your thoughts, your emotions, and reactions with enough clarity that you're simply not running on autopilot, not just repeating the stories that you interpreted, not just reacting to the algorithm blindly without actually seeing what is underlying it, not just performing the identity your tribe expects you to perform every single day. This is why meditation appears in the book not as some kind of a wellness trend but as a culmination of the entire argument. Harari has practiced something that we call as vipassana, which is meditation, for years, and he presents it not as some mysticism but as the most reliable empirical method for investigating your own experience, not to feel calm, not to be a better person, but to actually see what's happening in your own mind. Because if you can't do that, you can't distinguish between a thought and a reality, between a story and the truth, between a programmed reaction and a genuine choice. The growth of meditation and mindfulness apps since the pandemic suggests something is resonating. Though often in a flattered sense, commodified form that Harari would probably wince at, the practice has been stripped of its philosophical teeth and repackaged as productivity tool, which misses the point entirely. Now, the honest pushback comes in, and here is where it actually matters. Critics rightly point out that just meditate is an absurdly thin answer to civilizational crisis. It's available mostly to people with time, safety, and material security to sit down still, which means it's essentially a luxury good for the global professional class. Someone working three jobs to feed their family doesn't need mindfulness, they need structural change. Harari would probably agree, but his point isn't that meditation actually replaces politics or policy. It's that without self knowledge, your politics and your policy will be determined and driven by unexamined stories, and you won't even know that is actually driven by these external factors. And you will fully validate yourself that these are ideas that are coming within you, and that is where the blind spot lies. And there's a second criticism that's actually worth sitting with. Harari's framework can read as overly detached, right? It can be overly detached sometimes. He analyzes nationalism, religion, community, identity with the cool distance of an anthropologist studying a distant tribe. That's analytically powerful, but it can miss why people clinch to these things. Not because they're actually confused, but because they are suffering. The need for belonging isn't a cognitive error to be corrected. It's a human need that has to be met somehow. And if the liberal order cannot go on to meet it, something else will. These criticisms don't dissolve like arguments, right? Where you put a for and against. They just get more complicated, which is exactly what first principles requires you to do. Sitting in the tough space, even though you're facing a lot of obstacles, clearly thinking about what you actually think about this without putting in any external biases before you can make that particular decision. Because the real takeaway of 21 lessons isn't a single lesson, it's the ability for a person to do a pattern recognition using first principles. Politics feel broken because it's running on software from the industrial age. Truth feels elusive because our information systems are optimized for engagement and not understanding. Nationalism is returning because humans need belonging and liberal democracy stopped providing it long ago. Religion persists because the secular alternative asks too much of people without offering enough in return. And education is stuck because nobody knows what to teach for a world that constantly keeps changing. These aren't separate problems, they're the same problem showing up in different domains. Human built a civilization that outpaces the very cognitive and emotional architecture that built it. Technology changes faster than institutions. Institutions change faster than culture. Culture changes faster than the individual mind. Every crisis that we have discussed is simply another expression of that particular widening gap. Politics, identity, religion, truth, education, artificial intelligence, they're all symptoms of the same underlying condition. And the gap between the world we've created and the minds we have is widening every single day, and it's extremely alarming. Every generation before ours inherited a relatively stable reality. Ours inherited an exponential change. The challenge isn't simply learning new skills, it's continuously rebuilding your understanding of reality itself. The people who thrive won't necessarily be the smartest, they'll be the ones capable of understanding their mental models faster than the world changes around them. The biggest challenge, ladies and gentlemen, of the 21st century isn't some kind of artificial intelligence or Gen AI. It isn't politics either. It's not technology as well. It's whether human beings specifically, can understand themselves quickly enough to keep up with the world that they have created.